They sang at midnight, voices pure, yet haunted. Behind the cathedral walls, a secret was whispered, not prayer, but confession. No one dared enter after the first notes faded, and those who did never returned. What you are about to hear is not legend. It is a record, a shadow of faith, twisted into terror. The midnight choir promised absolution, but delivered something darker, and tonight, their echoes awaken again. A thin mist clung to the cobblestones. The village slept beneath the weight of centuries. The cathedral rose beyond the fog, its spires like silent sentinels. Stone walls, worn and darkened by time, seemed to breathe. A single bell tower pierced the gray sky, its peak lost in low-hanging clouds. The air was cold, damp. It carried the faint tang of smoke from distant hearths and the distant, briny whisper of the river that cut through the village. The streets were narrow, almost suffocating. Timber-framed houses leaned toward each other, their windows dark, shuttered, but it was the cathedral that drew the eye. Massive doors of aged oak, scarred with centuries of hands, iron hinges black with rust, etched upon the lintel, the faint outlines of symbols, worn smooth by wind and rain. It did not announce itself, it demanded attention. Dr. Helius Harrow stepped from the carriage, boots crunching on the uneven stones. The historian's eyes lingered on the facade, tracing the lines of the cathedral, as though trying to read its memory. His notebook hung from his shoulder, a pen poised, though he had yet to write a single word. Locals had spoken of the choir, whispers at the tavern, a melody heard at midnight, divine, yet unsettling. They called it the midnight choir. Some said it was a blessing, others, a warning. Harrow felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He adjusted his coat and approached the steps. They were steep, slick with rain. A faint echo followed each footfall. Inside, the cathedral smelled of centuries, candle wax, dust, the faint metallic tang of old blood and stone. Light filtered through stained glass, muted and strange. Shadows pooled in corners. Columns, like giants, rose and vanished into darkness. The space was vast, incomprehensible. No one greeted him. A soft sound broke the silence. Not a word, not a voice, just a note, and then another. It was music. Harrow froze. It came from deep within the nave, somewhere beyond the reach of light. Gentle at first, almost a whisper, then louder, harmonic, painful, beautiful. It was impossible to place. The melody seemed older than the cathedral itself, older than the village. It carried weight, like the echo of thousands of prayers. He moved forward, boots echoing against stone. The music shifted, harmonies twisted in ways that should not exist, lingering at the edge of comprehension. And then he saw them, the choir. They were arranged in the shadowed altar space, figures robed in black, faces indistinct in the darkness, hands folded, still, waiting. They sang. No eyes met his, no one spoke, yet he felt their gaze, felt it press against the nape of his neck, felt it weigh on his chest, and yet he could not look away. The sound filled him, then emptied him, heart racing, breath shallow, a sense that he had stepped beyond a threshold he could never cross back. The village stories had been true. The music was divine, terrifying, wrong. Harrow tried to take a step closer. The choir did not pause. The note extended, stretched into something that tugged at his very bones. A sudden instinct made him reach for the door behind him, but it had vanished, or perhaps it had never existed. He was in the cathedral alone, and yet, not alone. The music shifted again, notes falling into silence, then rising, over and over, a slow, inevitable crescendo that made him feel as if the walls themselves were alive, listening, watching, judging. And then he heard it, a faint whisper beneath the song. "Do you see?" Harrow's breath caught. He looked around. Empty. The choir continued, unaware, unblinking, perfectly still. He wrote it in his notebook anyway, words scrawled with trembling hand. "Do you see?" A shiver crawled down his spine. Something was off, but he could not leave. The music held him, anchored him to the stone floor. He noticed the architecture more closely now. The carvings in the columns, faces, twisted, some holy, some grotesque, saints and sinners fused into one impossible form, eyes that seemed alive, mouths frozen mid-scream, and in the shadows between the columns, figures not part of the choir, watching, hidden, observing. He turned, slowly. The movement was deliberate, careful, nothing, yet the feeling remained. He was not alone, and that's when he realized the music was not just song, it was communication, a message encoded in harmonies, in rhythm, in pauses too brief for comprehension. Harrow's pen hovered over the page. He tried to decipher, tried to hear meaning, but each note pulled him deeper, reshaping perception. Hours, or was it minutes? Time had no hold here. The cathedral bent it, folded it, made him aware of its absence, and then a voice, clear and distinct, cut through the harmonies. "Welcome, seeker." The words were simple, ordinary, and yet they carried weight, gravity, fear, recognition. Harrow spun. No one, only the choir, only the shadows, only the candlelight flickering along stone walls. "Who speaks?" he whispered. No answer. The music shifted again, this time a dissonance, a note that grated against the ears, a sudden violent interruption in what had been perfect order. Harrow stumbled back. His notebook fell, pages fluttered. The melody resumed as though nothing had happened, calm, serene, but the disruption lingered in his mind. He began to take notes frantically, symbols, words, descriptions, anything, but the cathedral seemed to resist documentation. Every time he wrote, the shadows moved. Every time he looked, faces changed. Eyes that had once been closed now stared. And the choir remained silent in countenance, singing with voices that could belong to angels or demons, or both. A door at the far end of the nave creaked, subtle but audible. Harrow approached, hesitated. Every instinct screamed retreat, yet curiosity, the historian's curse, pressed him onward. He opened it. A corridor, narrow, lit by sconces that burned with a pale, uneven flame. The air was warmer here, smelled of wax and old stone. A faint echo of footsteps, not his own, something following. He paused, listened, nothing, and then he felt it, a presence behind him, close, breathing, not human, or not entirely human. Harrow turned sharply. "Empty," he wrote, trembling. Empty, yet present. The corridor ended in a small room, sparse, a single chair, a lectern, music sheets scattered on the floor, notes meticulously handwritten, every mark precise, almost obsessive. He picked one up, lines of music, symbols he did not recognize, patterns that seemed alive, and that's when he heard the choir again, this time from somewhere impossibly far, or impossibly close, perhaps both. A single note, extended, sustained, shaking the air, vibrating the walls, pressing into his chest. Harrow fell to his knees, eyes shut, mind racing, thoughts scattering. The air itself seemed to hum, and then silence, absolute, crushing. He opened his eyes. The room was empty. No chair, no lectern, no music sheets, only the cold stone walls. But the echo remained, a single word, lingering in his mind: stay. He stumbled to the door, pushed it open, and found himself back in the nave. The choir had stopped, faces blank, robed figures waiting, motionless, expectant. Harrow's heart pounded. The candlelight flickered, shadows danced, He realized with a sinking certainty that the cathedral had changed while he had been gone. Columns had shifted. The space felt smaller, closer, confined, and he understood with a clarity that terrified him. He had been led, guided, drawn in. There was no turning back. The historian had arrived to document a choir, but the choir had come to document him. He sat on the cold stone floor, notebook clutched to his chest, listening to the silence that followed, waiting. A low murmur began at the edges of hearing. The choir, returning, slowly, methodically, inescapable, and he knew, somewhere deep in the marrow of his bones, that the night had only just begun. A thin fog lingered along the stone corridors, candles guttered in iron sconces, casting wavering shadows that stretched and recoiled. Dr. Elias Harrow moved slowly, notebook in hand, eyes tracing the walls. Every surface seemed alive, every crack, every pockmark, held the memory of centuries. The cathedral's silence pressed against him, thick and deliberate. The pews were empty, but the air carried something beyond absence, a subtle vibration, a faint murmur that disappeared when he focused on it. He knelt to examine the stone floor. Inscribed faintly into the flagstones were words, half-erased prayers, worn smooth by time and neglect, some written in Latin, others in a script he could not identify, lines overlapping lines, words unfinished, questions left unanswered. A cold draft swept along the corridor, not from the windows, not from the doorways. It moved as though the walls themselves exhaled. Harrow shivered, but something wasn't right. He rose and followed the draft deeper into the cathedral. The nave stretched above him, enormous, almost endless. Light fell unevenly, through stained glass, painting the floor in fractured colors. The music from the previous night seemed to echo faintly, a memory trapped in stone. The choir was present, always present. They moved silently along narrow aisles, hands folded, eyes lowered, faces calm, expressionless. Yet when they thought no one watched, when they were alone in a shadowed corner, they spoke in hushed, urgent tones, words that vanished when he tried to approach, conversations without sound. He paused near a pew. Carved initials, dates, and faint prayers marked the wood. Some were scratched with care, others gouged with panic. He ran a finger over the carvings. The wood was cold, unnatural. The grooves seemed deeper than the surface, as though they had been carved from memory, rather than material. And that's when he heard it. A whisper, faint from the choir loft above. Not a voice he could place, not a language he understood, but urgency laced every syllable. Fear, command, submission. Harrow climbed the narrow stone staircase, the steps uneven, worn by countless feet over countless years. Each footfall echoed through the nave, repeated, multiplied, almost as though the building itself were mimicking him. The loft opened into a space of shadow and silence. Choir robes hung like shadows themselves, empty but present. Music sheets littered the floor, pages curling with age. Faintly, he saw markings in red ink, notations, diagrams, something resembling maps. He bent closer. Symbols overlapped notes, lines crossed lines. Patterns that did not match musical conventions, patterns that seemed purposeful, deliberate, threatening in their precision. Cold air drifted along his neck. He froze. The choir appeared below, not moving, yet watching, or so it felt. He could not tell if they were aware of him. The rhythm of their breathing matched the flicker of candles along the nave. Time slowed, each second elongated. Chero made notes quickly, pen shaking, footsteps, soft, behind him. He turned, empty, and yet, presence lingered. He followed a corridor to the side of the nave, narrow, enclosed, stone walls pressed in. Inscriptions continued here, words half erased, prayers that seemed almost desperate. Some scratched backward, as if written to be unreadable. Others repeated, "Watch, obey, remember." He traced the letters. A shiver ran down his spine, and then the whispering returned, closer, softer, urgent, echoing from every corner. Not a choir, not a person, something in between, something human-shaped, but impossible. Harrow's notebook fell. Pages fluttered across the floor. He scrambled to gather them. Symbols and notes mingled, a chaotic tapestry of meaning he could not yet grasp. In the far corner of the corridor, a door stood ajar. Light escaped, in slivers. He approached, heart hammering, breath shallow. Inside, a small chamber, sparse, a single lectern, music sheets piled in meticulous disorder, candles burned low, wax dripping like coagulated blood, and the choir, one member, standing alone, eyes downcast, hands moving, tracing invisible patterns in the air, lips moving silently, forming words that vanished before they reached comprehension. Harrow approached, notebook ready. The figure turned, a slow, deliberate motion, eyes meeting his for a fleeting instant, cold, empty, piercing. Then the member whispered, not to him, not to anyone, just words for themselves. "Do not follow." Harrow froze. The hallway seemed to stretch. Columns rose impossibly high. Shadows shifted without source. Music swelled faintly, then fell away, leaving a ringing in the ears. And that's when he noticed the patterns on the walls. Not carvings, not graffiti, faint impressions, almost invisible, tracing shapes too deliberate to be accidental, geometries that suggested confinement, paths, instructions. He felt trapped, and yet, curiosity forced him forward. The choir moved again, slow, methodical, not in formation, not in song, just movement. Every step calculated, every glance purposeful. Harrow followed. A side corridor opened to a small chapel. Stained glass cast fractured shadows. The altar was simple, yet something about it unsettled him. The stone beneath his feet vibrated faintly, a pulse, like a heartbeat. He knelt, studied the inscriptions along the base of the altar. Faint scratches, names, dates, some recent, some centuries old. And then he saw it, a single page, tucked beneath the altar cloth. Music notations, symbols, instructions, a name, Elias Harrow. His hand shook. He read, lines of music overlaid with words. Watch, obey, learn. The choir's whispers rose around him. Not a melody, not song, just breath, urgency, commands. Murmurs from every corner of the cathedral, faint but insistent. Harrow stepped back, stumbled, heart racing, breath ragged. The space seemed alive, the walls pulsing, and then the choir member appeared behind him, silent, watching, waiting. He spun, empty, but the presence remained, felt it pressing on him from all sides. A low note vibrated through the cathedral, subtle at first, then growing, not from the choir, not from an instrument, from the stone itself. Harrow fell to his knees, eyes wide, mind teetering. The inscriptions on the walls seemed to shift, words elongated, letters stretched into shapes that twisted reality. Praise and commands blended. The air thickened. Every breath he took felt like inhaling stone. And that's when he understood the choir did not merely sing. They orchestrated, manipulated, observed. The cold drafts pressed along his skin. Whispering rose to a roar inside his mind. He tried to write. Notes spilled from his pen. Symbols he could not recognize. Patterns forming. Meaning he could not grasp. The choir member stepped forward, hand outstretched, not threatening, not welcoming, just precise, calculated. Harrow backed away, but the cathedral shifted, corridors elongated, shadows multiplied, the air thickened, presence pressed down. He realized he could not leave. The music rose again, distant yet overwhelming. The whispers followed, weaving through every crevice, every stone, every shadow. Harrow sank against the wall, notebook clutched to his chest, breath coming in shallow gasps, eyes darting, mind unraveling, and then silence, absolute crushing. But it was not empty, not really. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible. Stay. He pressed his hands to his ears, tried to block it, tried to leave, but the choir waited, always waiting, and he knew with a sinking certainty that the cathedral had claimed him. The whispers among the pews were not guidance, they were instruction, observation, judgment. Harrow realized, in the deepest recesses of his mind, that he was no longer the historian, he was the subject. A thick fog rolled over the village as night fell. The cathedral stood in silhouette, its spires scraping the darkened sky. Elias Harrow approached the nave, boots crunching on wet cobblestones. The air smelled of damp stone and burning candle wax. A thin wind carried the faint murmur of unseen waters. Tonight, the choir would rehearse. The first of midnight. He paused at the heavy oak doors. Iron hinges groaned under the pull. He pushed them open. Inside, the cathedral was alive with shadow. Candles flickered, their flames bending as though buffeted by a breeze. No one could see. The pews stretched in neat rows, each surface polished by centuries of hands. Carved inscriptions caught the candlelight, twisting in shapes both beautiful and strange. And then he saw them, the choir members, robed in black, arranged in formation along the nave, faces serene, eyes closed, hands folded, but the stillness was deceptive. There was tension in their shoulders, a quiet strain in their posture. Harrow's pen hovered over his notebook. He took careful steps forward, boots echoing against stone. But something wasn't right. The music began, soft, tentative, harmonies layered over one another, rising in pitch, falling in depth. The sound was divine, yet undercut with a strange dissonance that set the nerves on edge. Harrow's eyes swept the choir. He noticed the smallest details. A face contorted slightly, eyes twitching beneath closed lids, lips moving without sound, fingers trembling at the edges of folded hands. A candle flickered, its light danced across a row of faces, revealing sudden distortions, grief, fear, pain, etched into features that had moments before appeared calm. And that's when he heard it, a low hum beneath the song, not from voices, not from instruments, a vibration in the stone, felt through the floor, climbing up the soles of his boots. Harrow stepped back, his pen shaking. The choir shifted in unison, movement small, almost imperceptible, yet synchronized, almost mechanical. He noted everything, the way one member's eyes flickered open, catching the candlelight, before closing again, the way their breathing became irregular, almost desperate. The music itself changed, notes stretched unnaturally, bending, twisting. Harmonies that should have resolved remained suspended. Tension hung thick in the air, pressing against the chest. Harrow's mind raced. The patterns in the notes did not match traditional composition. It was deliberate, controlled, but by whom? Candles continued to flicker, casting shadows that moved independently, elongating along the floor, stretching along walls, pooling in corners where no light should reach. A choir member bent slightly, mouth opening in a silent scream. Only the shadow betrayed it, twisting unnaturally, echoing pain. Harrow froze. The music shifted again, louder now, discordant yet strangely beautiful. The sound seemed to occupy space differently. It wrapped around him, pushed against his body, shaped his perception. He tried to write, but his hand trembled uncontrollably. Symbols, descriptions, words spilling across the page in frantic strokes. And then the whispering began, soft, urgent, from the choir, from the walls, from nowhere, and everywhere, at once. Look closer. Do not interfere. Stay still. Harrow's heartbeat thundered in his chest, breath coming in short gasps. A shadow shifted at the edge of his vision. He turned, empty, but the feeling remained. A presence watching, assessing, waiting. The choir moved with slow precision, every note, every breath calculated, faces contorted, yet never breaking formation. Agony pressed into each line, silent, inescapable. The candlelight began to dim, one by one, faint pools of darkness forming beneath the pews, shadows gathering in the corners. Harrow stumbled toward the back, tried to escape the sensation of suffocation, but the nave stretched endlessly. Columns seemed taller, the roof higher, the space larger, yet constricting at once. And that's when he heard it again. A single note, extended, sustained, piercing, felt through bone and marrow. A choir member's head jerked sharply, silently, pain etched across the features. The shadow behind them writhed. Harrow pressed himself against the wall, eyes wide, breath ragged, mind struggling to process what he saw. The music rose, crescendo building, notes overlapping, discordant harmonies layering atop one another. An impossible pattern. He realized the song was not merely music. It was communication, instruction, observation. The shadows moved differently now, independent of light, twisting, stalking, pressing closer. Harrow's hand shook as he wrote. Words spilled in frantic lines. Symbols, Latin prayers half erased, descriptions of faces that had changed before his eyes. Candles flickered again, shadows coiling around the choir members. They remained silent, but the shapes suggested screams, movements frozen, mid-gesture, agony captured in stone and shadow. He backed toward a column, trying to remain unseen, trying to breathe, trying to understand. And then he saw the floor, beneath the altar, engravings, symbols, lines converging, leading to nowhere, and everywhere at once. The music twisted again, unnatural, chaotic, perfectly orchestrated chaos. Harrow's vision blurred, heart racing, mind unraveling. The choir's faces contorted further, eyes rolling beneath lids, silent cries escaping from mouths that did not move. He pressed his hands to his ears, tried to block the sound, tried to block the reality, but the cathedral did not relent. The shadows shifted, the air thickened, the notes seemed to pierce the walls, the floor, the very stone itself. Harrow fell to his knees, notebook clutched to his chest, eyes wide, staring at the choir. Candles flickered violently, shadows moved as if alive, columns bent imperceptibly. The nave seemed to pulse, and then silence, absolute. For a moment, the only sound was his own ragged breathing. He looked up. The choir had stopped, faces calm, expressionless, masks of serenity, and yet, he could not forget, could not unsee, could not unhear. A single note lingered in his mind, not sung, not played, felt, and that's when he understood. The music was no longer music. It was control. It was possession, judgment. Harrow pressed himself to the floor, heart pounding, eyes darting, mind teetering on the edge. The first midnight rehearsal had begun, and he knew, with sinking certainty, that he would never leave the cathedral unchanged. The choir's song had claimed him, and the shadows were patient. A faint light spilled across the nave, barely illuminating the worn stone floor. Dust motes drifted in its glow, suspended in the air like fragments of memory. Dr. Elias Harrow knelt at the base of the altar, notebook forgotten at his side. He had noticed the shift immediately. Something about the stone seemed deliberate, not part of the structure, not visible at first glance. A seam, a line, a subtle imperfection that spoke of concealment. He traced it with a fingertip, cold, hard, unyielding, but something wasn't right. The candlelight flickered, shadows stretched along the walls, columns seemed to lean closer. The nave itself felt watchful. Harrow's curiosity, that historian's compulsion, overcame hesitation. He pressed a hand to the floor, searching for a mechanism, a latch, anything that would reveal what lay beneath the altar's heavy stones. And that's when he heard it. A faint click, a vibration under his palm. A door, concealed, ancient, sliding aside with effort, revealing steps leading downward into darkness. He descended slowly. Each step echoed. The walls of the stairwell were damp, cold, carved with faint inscriptions, names, dates, unfinished prayers. Some lines were so deeply etched, they seemed to pulse in the candlelight. The air grew heavier, denser, a subtle scent, faint yet undeniable, of old paper and leather, of wax, and something sweeter, metallic, coppery, a hint of decay. The chamber opened beneath the altar, small, narrow, claustrophobic, walls lined with shelves, and on the shelves, rows of bound leather volumes, personal confessions, diaries, journals, some blackened with age, others preserved as if recently written. Harrow's breath caught. He stepped forward, fingers hovering over the nearest volume. Leather cracked beneath his touch, ink faded but legible, names and dates, sins catalogued with obsessive care, every entry a confession, every confession a secret. He opened one, a priest, writing of clandestine rituals, acts performed in the dead of night, forbidden prayers, feared indulgences. The writing trembled, as if the hand itself had feared discovery, and the more he read, the colder the air became, a weight pressing against his chest, a presence, not visible, not tangible, but felt, feeding, waiting. Harrow flipped through several volumes, each confession more disturbing than the last. Unspoken sins, deeds that twisted morality beyond recognition, acts recorded with meticulous horror, and beneath every line, a pattern, a subtle rhythm, a pulse. And that's when he heard it again. Not a voice, not song, but a low murmur, rising from the stone itself, echoing through the chamber, almost imperceptible at first, then unmistakable. It was as if the confessions themselves had a voice, speaking, watching, waiting, judging. Harrow's hand trembled. He dropped the book. Pages fanned out across the floor. The smell of leather and old ink filled the air, intoxicating and oppressive. He tried to steady himself, tried to rationalize, but every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The chamber was not empty. A shadow shifted in the corner, not cast by candlelight, not a trick of the eye. It moved independently, flickering against the stone. He approached, notebook at the ready, every step measured, every breath cautious. Shelves stretched upward, crowded, names, dates, confessions reaching toward darkness, and behind them, faint etchings in the wall, symbols, geometric patterns, lines connecting dots, instructions, warnings. He could not tell, and then he felt it, a pressure at the back of his mind, pulling, not violent, not overt, but insistent, urgent. He turned, expecting someone, no one, yet the sense remained, observed, an awareness not human, Not mortal, something older, patient, calculating. Harrow's pen scratched across the page, trying to capture the detail, every sentence a record of dread, every note trembling with fear and fascination. The confessions revealed more than acts. They hinted at influence, at a presence feeding on guilt, absorbing fear, shaping behavior, growing stronger with each admission. And that's when he noticed movement among the shadows. Not the choir, not any living person, but the shadows themselves, shifting toward him, responding to observation. Candles flickered violently, shadows danced, columns warped, stone walls seemed to breathe. Harrow stumbled back, heart racing, breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He opened another volume. The writing detailed a nighttime vigil, a choir singing in darkness, eyes wide, faces strained, rituals performed with reverence and terror, names of participants listed, notes on behavior, observations on fear. The words resonated, not in meaning, but in effect. The chamber seemed to hum, walls vibrating, leather-bound confessions whispering in unison. And that's when he understood the chamber, the books, the presence, all connected, feeding, responding, manipulating, observing every thought, every reaction. He tried to leave, step back toward the stairwell, but the chamber stretched, distances elongated, shadows formed barriers, walls closed in imperceptibly, the air grew thick, each breath a labor. Harrow pressed himself against the wall, notebook clutched to his chest, eyes darting, mind racing. A soft rustle from the far corner, a book sliding slightly on its own. Not gravity, not wind, something deliberate. He stepped closer, hand trembling as he reached for it, leather warm under his fingers, ink fresh, recent, not centuries old, a confession just made, just written. The words inside mirrored his own thoughts, his fears, his doubts, his curiosity, his guilt. He stumbled backward. The walls seemed to lean closer, shadows pressing, indistinct yet oppressive, and then silence, absolute. For a moment, the only sound was his own ragged breathing. But the chamber waited, watching, responding, patient. Harrow realized he was not merely observing history. He was part of it, recorded, catalogued, consumed. And that's when he understood the cathedral, the choir, the confessions. None of it was accidental. He had entered a system older than memory, a mechanism of observation, of control. The presence feeding on guilt, stirred, a low vibration through stone and air, felt more than heard, felt in bone and marrow. Harrow sank to his knees, hands clutching notebook and robes, eyes wide, mind unraveling. The chamber beneath the altar had revealed itself, and in doing so, it had revealed him. The first flicker of awareness, that he was no longer the historian, he was the subject. The shadows shifted closer, the books leaned toward him, leather-bound whispers pressing into his ears, and he knew, with a sinking certainty, that he would never leave unchanged. A thin haze clung to the nave, curling around the columns like smoke trapped in stone. Candles guttered along the walls, their light trembling in irregular pulses. Dr. Elias Harrow moved slowly, notebook in hand, eyes scanning every shadow. The cathedral seemed larger tonight, higher ceilings, longer corridors, endless rows of pews stretching beyond comprehension. The choir was present, or at least it had been, but something wasn't right. He had watched them vanish before his eyes, figures robed in black, walking in formation, then suddenly absent. No door, no hiding place, no explanation, only the echo of movement. Harrow's pen hovered over the page, notes unsteady, mind racing. The first whispers began, not voices, not song, just murmurs, soft, unfinished. carried across empty corridors. Confess, remember, do not look away. And that's when he heard it. A footstep, not from him, not in rhythm with the choir, a solitary step, deliberate, hesitant. He turned, empty, yet he felt it. Presence, watching, waiting. He stepped toward the altar. Candles flickered violently, shadows dancing independently of flame. Columns stretched like fingers into darkness. Harrow's eyes caught movement. In the corner of his vision, a choir member, standing, then gone, vanished. He blinked, heart pounding. The whispering rose, not from one source, multiple, overlapping, impossible to locate. Elias. His pen fell, notebook open, lines of observation scrawled across the page. Now meaningless. He moved down a side corridor. The walls pressed closer. Every stone seemed to breathe. The air grew thick, almost viscous. A door at the end creaked, faintly, tentatively. He approached. Inside, the space was empty, or appeared so, and yet, he saw them. Figures moving at the edges of his vision. Choir members, hollow eyes, trembling hands, faces pale, expression frozen in silent anguish. They mimicked actions he had seen before, singing, praying, folding hands, kneeling, all in perfect, ghostly synchronization. He stepped forward. They vanished. A whisper followed, soft, urgent. Look closer. Listen carefully. Harrow's mind spun. Time stretched. Minutes bled into hours. He could not be certain if he had moved, or if the cathedral itself shifted beneath him. And then he saw it again. A choir member, emerging from the shadowed nave. Not the same one. Not the one he had seen before. Eyes wide, mouth moving in silent confession, hands trembling, as if racked with guilt or fear. He wrote furiously, notebook shaking, symbols, descriptions, observations, words failing him. Candles flickered, shadows warped. The air carried a scent of wax, dust, and something acrid, coppery, metallic, almost blood, but faint, almost imagined. Harrow moved down another corridor, steps careful. The whispers followed, echoing, layered, conflicting. He paused, tried to locate their source. Impossible. They came from everywhere and nowhere. A choir member appeared at the far end, then another behind him, then another, vanishing before he could reach them. The hollow eyes stared through him. Trembling hands clutched at the air. Confessions mouthed silently, words lost to the stillness. And that's when he heard it. A chorus of voices, not in unison, not song, just murmurs overlapping, in impossible cadence, echoing down empty halls, twisting around corners, around pillars, into rooms with no doors. He backed toward the nave, candles flickering violently, shadows pooling beneath the pews, reaching, twisting, pressing closer. Harrow's heart pounded, breath short, eyes wide, mind unraveling. He stumbled into the main aisle. Choir members reappeared suddenly, in impossible numbers, silent, watching, hollow eyes following his every move. He tried to speak, words failed him. Only a shallow gasp escaped. The whispers rose, a tidal wave of murmurs. Confessions carried on breathless air. Names, deeds, sins, secrets, all pointing toward him. The figures moved with a slow, deliberate precision, not threatening, not welcoming, but calculated, mechanical, observant. Harrow pressed himself against a column, tried to gather his thoughts. Notebook clutched, hands trembling, and then one of them reached toward him, hand extended, hollow eyes staring, mouth moving silently, words forming, without sound. He stepped back. Another appeared, then another, lines of them stretching down the nave, vanishing and reappearing at impossible intervals.
And that's when he realized the cathedral had become a labyrinth of observation, shadows, whispers, figures, all orchestrated with silent precision. Time warped, minutes elongated, candles flickered faster, shadows danced wildly, the air vibrated with unspoken words. Harrow sank to his knees, eyes darting, mind spiraling, the hollow
eyes of former choir members imprinted in memory, hands trembling, silent confessions pressed against him from every direction. He tried to write. Notebook fell, pages scattered, words meaningless, observations lost in chaos. A single whisper penetrated the tumult, clear, distinct, intimate. Stay. He pressed his hands to his ears, tried to block the murmurs, tried to flee, but the figures followed, vanishing, reappearing, always observing, always waiting. Harrow's breath came in ragged gasps. Candles flickered, shadows shifted, the choir's presence extended through stone, air, and memory. He realized he could not leave, not yet, not without understanding. The voices echoed, relentless, layered, feeding on fear, on guilt, on curiosity. And that's when he understood. He was no longer merely a witness. He had become a participant, catalogued, observed, examined. Harrow pressed himself against the cold stone floor, eyes wide, mind unraveling, heart racing. The choir vanished, or so it seemed, but their whispers remained, and he knew, with a sinking certainty, that they would never stop, that the cathedral had claimed him, and the voices would echo forever. Sallow gray mist clung to the hills surrounding the village. The cathedral rose beyond the fog, its spires jagged against a dim, suffocating sky. Windows glinted faintly, like distant, unblinking eyes. Elias Harrow paused at the edge of the graveled courtyard, notebook in hand. Few slick stones glimmered faintly beneath the weight of his boots. Each step brought a soft, wet crunch. He breathed in, the air cold, sharp, carrying a scent of earth and rain, and something older. Inside, the nave was quiet, not just quiet, anticipatory, pregnant with expectation. Shadows clung to columns, candles flickered along the aisle, trembling like nervous hearts. The stone seemed colder than it should have been, ancient, immovable, yet somehow alive. Father Matthias, the elderly priest, awaited him. His hands trembled slightly as he folded them across his chest, eyes fixed on the worn stone floor. Every wrinkle on his face seemed pressed deeper into shadow, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. "To the choir," he began, voice low, almost a whisper. "Heat has always been more than music." Harrow leaned forward, pen poised. Every sense was sharpened, each shadow a potential witness. But something wasn't right. The earliest records are fragmentary, Father Matthias continued. Accounts of young singers disappearing, reappearing, changed, silent, eyes wide, minds unmoored. Villagers whispered of a presence, feeding on fear, guilt, confession itself. Traro wrote rapidly, notebook shaking in his grip. "And that's when I realized," the priest said, voice trembling. It was not only their voices the cathedral claimed, it was their reality, their perception of the world. The cathedral seemed to hum softly around them. Every shadow along the nave stretched, leaning closer, curling in on itself. The columns rose taller than memory. Aloud, stone groaned under the weight of unseen steps, or perhaps under time itself. The historian followed Father Matthias to a small side chapel. Dust lay thick on the floor. Candles flickered along the walls, their wax dripping like frozen tears. The air smelled of smoke and old stone, but beneath that, a subtle tang of iron, a reminder of what had passed here. Father Matthias gestured toward a carved pew. "A survivor once described sitting here," he said, sighs listening to the choir. The music twisted his memory. Every note reminded him of sins he thought long buried. Every harmony forced confession he could not escape. Harrow shivered. The words were not testimony. They were warning. The priest's eyes darkened. He could not sleep. He heard voices repeating his sins. Names, details, over and over. He could no longer distinguish thought from sound, dream from waking, reality from cathedral. Harrow's pen hovered, his mind a whirlpool. Candles flickered, shadows twisted. The air itself seemed to pulse, carrying voices just beneath perception. And there were others. Father Matthias continued. A mother whose son sang in the choir. She found him standing in the nave, muttering prayers backward, eyes hollow. He could not recognize her. He remembered only the music, only the voice that demanded perfection, obedience, secrecy. Harrow's stomach tightened. Candles flickered again. Shadows stretched along the walls, pooling beneath pews, reaching toward the ceiling. The columns seemed to bend imperceptibly, leaning closer. They returned to us, the priest said, voice low, almost a hiss. Those who did, but never whole. Some, lost entirely. Others carry it still. Nightmares, voices, the sense of always being watched. Harrow's pen shook. Every instinct screamed. Yet he could not stop writing. Father Matthias led him toward a small alcove beneath the altar. Dusty books lined the walls, leather-bound, cracked. Each one contained confessions, observations, sins unspoken, fears captured with obsessive care. They were witnesses, the priest said softly. The cathedral collects them, all of them, every note, every confession, every trembling hand, and it remembers. Harrow could feel the cathedral's pulse in the stone beneath his feet. A low vibration, subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent. His heartbeat quickened, and that's when he heard it. Father Matthias whispered. The music outside, the voices echoing through empty halls. The choir, singing for no one, but listening to everything. The historian turned toward the nave. Shadows pooled in corners, shifting unnaturally. Figures pale, with wide unblinking eyes, trembled in the candlelight. Harrow wrote furiously, words spilling onto pages. Every observation mattered, every detail. Father Matthias's voice trembled. I am one of the few left to speak. The rest, consumed by their own sins, or by the choir, by the cathedral. It does not care which. It only observes, records, feeds. The historian's stomach churned. Every instinct screamed flight, yet he could not move. The alcove of books seemed alive. Leather hummed faintly, resonating with his presence. Eyes everywhere, he thought. Hundreds, thousands, watching. The choir rehearses at midnight. Father Matthias continued, gesturing toward the nave. The voices echo. They will not end. And they remember everything. Every confession, every trembling hand, every thought, every doubt. Harrow felt it pressing in. The cathedral observing. The shadows leaning. Candles flickering violently. Air thickening, compressing. Breath became laborious. A whisper brushed his ear. Not from the priest. Not from anyone. Remember. Confess. Obey. He spun. Empty. Father Matthias stepped back. Silent. Trembling. And then more whispers layered atop each other. Confessions. Names. Deeds. Sins of the past centuries. All reaching toward him. Unrelenting. Harrow sank to his knees. Hands pressed to ears. Eyes wide. Mind unraveling. The cathedral's pulse rose. Shadows coiled. Columns stretched. Candles flickered violently. The echoes of countless sins filled the nave, looping endlessly. He realized he was no longer merely a witness. He had become part of the cathedral's history, catalogued, observed, examined. Father Matthias's voice, quivering, cut through the turmoil. Once you have witnessed, you are claimed, part of it. It will never release you.
Never forgive you. Never forget. Harrow's vision blurred. Shadows pressed. Indistinct yet oppressive. Candles guttered. The echoes of sins filled every corner. He knew, with crushing certainty, he would never leave unchanged. The choir's music, the cathedral's presence, the weight of sin and confession, they had claimed him, and the first witness had just arrived. A thin veil of fog clung to the cathedral steps, curling around the carved stone like smoke trapped in memory. Candles flickered along the nave, their light quivering, trembling against the heavy shadows cast by the columns. Dr. Elias Harrow descended the stairwell beneath the altar. Each step echoed softly, a hollow sound swallowed by the darkness below. The air grew colder, damp, thick with dust and something faintly coppery. The chamber revealed itself slowly. Walls of stone, worn smooth by centuries, lined with shelves of leather-bound confessions. Every volume seemed to vibrate with history, with secrecy. But something wasn't right. Harrow paused. Candles in his hand cast dancing shadows across the walls. Ritual implements lay arranged with meticulous care. Chalices, knives dulled by age, vessels carved with intricate symbols. Blood-stained hymnals rested on a low table, pages curling from moisture and time. And that's when he heard it. A low murmur, indistinct, almost imperceptible. It came from the very stone, from the books themselves. A whisper of voices long silenced, but somehow still present. He stepped forward, fingers trembling. He reached for the nearest book. Leather cracked beneath his touch. The page inside detailed a confession, acts committed in secret, thoughts whispered only in darkness, observations on guilt, fear, and submission. The air thickened, candles flickered violently, shadows seemed to stretch toward him, reaching, pressing. Harrow's eyes caught movement. The blackened chalice on the central altar, smooth, obsidian, almost liquid in appearance. Stains darkened its surface, remnants of countless rituals. He approached it cautiously, noting how the stone beneath it seemed to pulse faintly, as if aware of his presence. The ritual implements appeared, arranged with purpose, not ceremony. Knives and chalices positioned precisely, as though to capture, to guide. Each hymnbook splayed open to a particular passage, lines of text almost alive, whispering sins to the attentive eye. Harrow flipped through more confessions. A choir member described kneeling for hours in the dark. Another wrote of voices echoing their own doubts and fears back at them. A child confessed to thoughts she did not understand, and years later, recorded it again. The books formed a network of obsession, of guilt, of control. The shadows shifted, candles guttered. The air carried a faint metallic scent, sharp and intrusive. Harrow's breath quickened. He pressed a hand to the wall, feeling its cold solidity, grounding himself against the rising panic. And that's when he heard it again. A choir member's voice. Not a song, not a chant, just a whisper. A single word repeated. Confess. He spun, searching the corners. Empty. Harrow took another step. The chalice gleamed black, almost liquid. His reflection in its surface was distorted, pale, hollow-eyed. He saw not himself, but an echo of fear, mirrored back. The hymnal seemed to twitch beneath his gaze, as though responding. Opened pages rustled softly, murmuring the sins of those long gone. He could read them without understanding them fully, yet their weight pressed upon him. Each confession a thread, weaving into something vast, deliberate, and impossibly old. The chamber seemed to contract, closing in imperceptibly. The air became dense, oppressive. Breathing was laborious. Shadows crept along the walls like crawling fingers. The candles flickered. The black chalice remained at the center, absorbing light, absorbing him. Harrow's notebook fell to the floor. He reached for it, hands trembling. Every instinct screamed withdrawal, escape. But curiosity anchored him, compelled him to record, to observe, to understand. He moved from table to table. Every implement, every book, Every stain spoke of the choir's ultimate purpose, feeding not on flesh, not on blood alone, but on guilt, on confession, on the weight of sin poured
willingly into ink, stone, and ritual. And that's when he realized the chamber itself was a witness, a participant, absorbing, recording, amplifying the remorse and terror of centuries. He backed slowly, eyes scanning, shadows flickering. A hymn book tumbled to the floor with a soft thump, pages spreading wide, lines of confession crawled across the page, as if alive, detailing his own thoughts, his own doubts, his own hidden fears. Harrow's pulse raced, candles guttered violently, shadows pooled beneath pews and pillars, stretching, lengthening, pressing toward him. The black chalice seemed to darken further, the stains almost pulsing, a rhythm in time with his heartbeat, each whisper now layered atop the last, an endless loop of accusation and fear. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The sound echoed, absorbed into the thick stone. A voice, faint and broken, whispered his name. Elias. Harrow froze. Not a hallucination, not imagination, but something in the air, something embedded in the very stone, something alive in the shadows. The ritual implements gleamed in the candlelight, knives positioned, like fingers pointing, chalices waiting to be filled, hymnals open, mouths of sin murmuring endlessly. He pressed himself against the wall, hands shaking, every breath a labor, every thought a betrayal. The cathedral, the choir, the chamber, they were not simply history, they were active, aware, consuming. And that's when the shadows moved again, not cast by candlelight, not trick of the eye, independent, intentional. A slow shuffle from the far corner, a tremor of sound beneath the floorboards. Harrow's mind spun. He could no longer distinguish observation from participation. Every shadow, every whisper, every reflection from the chalice became an accusation, a reflection of guilt he had not confessed aloud. He sank to his knees, notebook clutched to his chest, breath shallow, eyes wide, candles guttered, shadows pressing closer. The black chalice pulsed faintly, a heartbeat, or the echo of centuries of confessions, each whispered sin vibrating through stone, air and time, and then silence, absolute. But the chamber waited, watching, recording, feeding. Harrow realized he was no longer merely a historian. He was a participant, an observer already woven into the cathedral's design. The shadows curled closer, the hymnals whispered with fresh urgency. The chalice gleamed black, still, reflecting the hollow eyes staring back at him. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that he could never leave unchanged. The confession chamber had claimed him. The choir's purpose was clear, not song, not worship, but feeding. Feeding on guilt, on sin, on the confessions willingly offered, and those unspoken, collecting each tremor of fear, each shiver of shame. Harrow pressed himself into the corner, shivering, notebook open, recording, unable to stop, and the shadows waited. A gray light filtered through the cathedral's stained glass, fragments of color trembling across the stone floor. The nave seemed impossibly long tonight, stretching into shadows that clung to corners like thick fog. Dr. Elias. Harrow moved cautiously along the aisle. Candles flickered, guttering against a draft that whispered across the stone. Every breath carried the scent of wax, dust, and something acrid beneath it. The choir had gathered for the midnight rehearsal. Their robes were motionless, faces pale, eyes wide and unblinking. The air vibrated with expectation, but something wasn't right. Harrow paused. Notes from previous nights whispered in his memory. The vanished choir members, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands. Tonight felt different. The silence was heavy, almost tactile, pressing against his chest. The first note struck, a single high tone, clear, clean, beautiful, then another, slightly off, discordant, jarring, and that's when he heard it. A low undertone, beneath the music, a murmur rising from the walls themselves, faint yet insistent, unnatural. The choir began in earnest, voices layered, once harmonious, now twisting, contorting into something unfamiliar, notes bent, split, and shrieked. Music became noise, noise became terror. Harrow's heart raced, candles flickered, shadows lengthening, stretching across faces. Choir members' expressions twisted, lips quivered, eyes rolled back, hands trembled violently. He stepped backward, notebook clutched, pencil forgotten. The nave seemed to pulse, walls breathing in rhythm with the dissonant music. Voices overlapped, some whispered names, others spat accusations. Each sound pushed against him, pressing, invading. The historian stumbled toward the exit. The stone floor seemed to shift beneath his feet. Shadows thickened, pooling along pillars, coiling at the base of the altar, and that's when he saw it. Figures he had once thought human, choir members now unrecognizable, faces stretched into silent screams, mouths opened wide, yet no sound emerged. Limbs moved independently, trembling, jerking in discordant rhythm with the music. The congregation scattered, some fell to their knees, clutching faces, others tried to run. Shadows reached, engulfing them, pressing closer. Harrow ran, each step echoed unnaturally. Candles guttered and fell, flames hissing as they met the stone. Shadows swirled like smoke, enveloping pews, pillars, faithful alike. The music roared now, a wall of sound, screeching harmonies, broken by whispers of confession. Each note seemed alive, pressing into memory, twisting thought. He glanced back. Choir members vanished and reappeared, moving in impossible ways, faces hollow, hands trembling, voices merging into a singular, incomprehensible wail. The air was heavy, wet with fear. A metallic tang, sharp and sudden, cut across his senses. The shadows were alive, crawling, consuming, dragging those they touched into the stone floor. Harrow stumbled over fallen hymnals, pages splayed, ink smeared. Each page seemed to scream silently, documenting terror, cataloging fear. He reached the main doors. The stained glass glowed eerily, shadows cast in impossible angles. Outside, fog rolled over the village like a tide, swallowing sound. And that's when he heard it again, a final overwhelming note, deep, resonant, devouring. The cathedral shuddered, columns creaked, the nave seemed to collapse inward. Harrow pushed through the doors. Outside, the fog pressed against him, cold and suffocating. He turned back once. Through the cathedral windows, he saw them, choir members, or what they had become, faces twisted in silent agony. Shadows stretched outward, reaching into the village, devouring the remaining faithful, dragging them into darkness. The music echoed faintly, carried on the wind, screaming, chanting, accusing, notes impossible to distinguish, all at once, yet eternal. Harrow fell to his knees in the courtyard, breath ragged, hands shaking, eyes wide. He could still hear the whispers, still see the shadows slithering along the stone. The cathedral loomed above him, silent now, yet alive, and he knew the collapse was complete. Faith, hope, order, all devoured. The choir had finished its work, and he had survived, but at a cost he could not yet understand. A low fog drifted across the village streets, curling around the cracked cobblestones. The cathedral loomed beyond the mist, silent, windows black, towers sharp against a gray sky. Dr. Elias Harrow returned weeks after the collapse. The courtyard was empty, stones slick with rain, wind whispered through broken branches. He carried his notebook, worn and saturated with observations, notes of shadows, whispers, confessions, and terror. Yet the world outside had already begun to forget. Harrow approached the municipal office. Officials sat behind polished desks, faces neutral, hands folded,
files stacked neatly. The air smelled of ink, paper, and faintly of cleaning agents. "I'm here regarding the cathedral," he said. "The choir, the events last month." The clerk's eyes flickered briefly to his notebook, then a faint smile. "I'm afraid there is nothing to report," she said, voice calm, controlled, certain. "Nothing unusual occurred. Everything is in order." But something wasn't right. Harrow showed photographs, candlelight in twisted shadows, choir members, faces distorted, confessional volumes, ritual implements, the black chalice. The clerk glanced, then shook her head. "This hysteria has taken hold of the imagination," she said. "There are no records, no missing persons, no choir, nothing. You must have misunderstood." He left, notebook clutched tightly. The air outside was thick with fog and unease. The village seemed smaller, quieter, and that's when he heard it. A faint murmur drifting from the cathedral. Wind, or memory, voices, he could not tell, just a trace, barely audible, echoes of confessions, of whispers, of music warped beyond recognition. Harrow walked through the streets, windows shuttered, doors closed. Villagers watched him from behind curtains, their eyes wide, tense, fearful, lips pressed tightly together, not a word spoken. He approached the old inn. Its wood was weathered, paint peeling, door hung slightly ajar. Inside, the fire had long died, the hearth cold, chairs overturned, tables dusted thick, a single mug on the counter, half filled with stale liquid. The innkeeper emerged, trembling, apron faded, eyes darted to the cathedral, then to the street, then back. "They don't speak of it anymore," she said, voice hushed. "The choir, the voices, authorities say it never happened. Those who saw, they say they dreamed it. But we know better." Harrow wrote in silence, the candlelight flickering across the page. Every word, every observation, a fragile proof against the tide of denial. The village streets were empty now. Silence pressed against the ears. The fog thickened, curling around corners and alleys. Windows reflected dim light, but no movement, only shadows that seemed too long, too still. Harrow returned to the cathedral steps. The massive doors were sealed. Chains hung heavy. Rust crept along the hinges. A sign posted, "Closed for safety, no entry." But something wasn't right. The blackened windows seemed to watch him. The air grew colder. The stone beneath his fingers hummed faintly. Echoes of voices pressed at the edges of his hearing. He pressed his ear to the wood. A whisper, faint, almost drowned by wind. "Remember, confess, obey." Harrow pulled back, notebook tight against his chest. The cathedral remained silent, or so it appeared. He moved through the village, tracing each street, each alleyway. Windows shuttered, doors bolted. The townspeople avoided him. Yet from corners of eyes, he glimpsed movement, shadows twisting along walls, figures that should not be there. And that's when he saw it.
A child standing at a window, pale face pressed to glass, eyes wide, trembling hands clutching the sill, mouth opening, closing, trying to speak. Yet no words emerged, only a whisper, barely audible, lost in the fog. The choir, they remember. Harrow turned away, heart racing. The village seemed to shrink with each step. Streets narrowed, fog thickened, silence pressed like stone. He returned to the inn. The innkeeper shook her head. "The authorities, they do not want to hear. They close their files, remove the records, deny the existence. But we remember. We always remember." He wrote feverishly, each word an attempt to preserve memory, against institutional erasure, against denial, against silence. The fog thickened outside, shadows curled along the walls of buildings. The wind whispered through cracked windows and empty streets. Harrow paused before the cathedral. One last time, its towers rose sharp into the grey sky, the doors sealed, chains rusted, a sign of authority asserting control. Yet the stone beneath it hummed, echoes of music, confessions, ritual, and terror, pressed at the edges of perception. And that's when he heard it again. A faint, impossibly distant echo of the choir, distorted, fractured, whispering names, sins and secrets, a music that could not exist, a reminder that memory, witness, and fear could not be erased by ink, by paper, by denial. The historian shivered. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, to forget. But he knew the cathedral endured, the choir endured, and the village would never be the same, even as authorities dismissed all claims, sealing records, denying history. The shadow of that night remained. Whispered rumors, fragile and fleeting, drifted through the streets. The silence was heavy, pressing, unyielding, and in that silence, the cathedral watched, waiting, listening. Harrow turned away, notebook full, mind exhausted, eyes wide. The institutional denial was complete. The choir vanished from records, the cathedral sealed, but the memory persisted, and the village trembled quietly, haunted by what no one dared to name. A thin mist rolled across the valley, softening the edges of the crumbling village. The cathedral stood in ruins, its spires broken, stones cracked, yet somehow defiant against the passage of years. Dr. Elias Harrow approached carefully. The courtyard was overgrown. Weeds clawed through fissures in the stone. Moss coated the steps. Every surface was slick with rain and time. But something wasn't right. Even in ruin, the place seemed alive. Shadows lingered in the corners. Windows, shattered, still caught the faintest glimmer of light. A distant sound echoed through the empty nave. And that's when he heard it. A faint note, high, wavering, almost imperceptible. To music, though broken, drifting across the night air. To notes that carried a memory he could not escape. A choir, unseen, singing in fragments, fractured harmonies that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. Harrow stepped closer, boots crunching on fallen debris. The scent of damp stone, mixed with faint smoke, and the lingering iron tang of blood, long dried. Every step carried him deeper into memory and fear. To note for him, empty, columns fractured, walls pitted with time, yet the space seemed to breathe. Shadows curled across fallen pews, stretched across collapsed altars. Charodwit was absent, but the darkness shimmered faintly. He remembered the first visit, the hidden chamber, the black chalice, the confessions, all of it, as vivid now as decades before. And the memory pressed upon him like a living weight. But something wasn't right. The ruins whispered, faint murmurs drifted from collapsed walls, from beneath stones, confessions left unanswered, names, sins and whispers repeating endlessly. He could not distinguish the past from the present. Harrow walked among the rubble, pages from hymnals, soaked and torn, fluttered in the wind. Each syllable seemed to echo voices from long ago. A tremor of recognition ran through him. Every note a reminder, every shadow a witness. And that's when he saw it. A shadow moved at the far end of the nave. Not human, yet in form, echoing the posture of the choir he had once observed. It lingered near the collapsed altar, indistinct, blackened, yet somehow aware of him. The air grew colder, every breath visible, small clouds in the damp night. The ruined choir loft loomed above, jagged edges scraping the sky. Faint wind carried fragments of music, broken chants, notes twisted and incomplete. Harrow moved closer to the altar. Stones beneath his fingers hummed faintly, vibrating in resonance with the distant notes. He knelt, touching the cold surface, feeling the memory of centuries embedded in stone and ritual. Whispers rose around him, almost imperceptible, echoes of confessions, some old, some fresh, carried by time, but not lost. They wrapped around his mind, probing, searching, asking questions he could not answer. The blackened chalice had long vanished, yet its presence lingered. He felt it in the pulse of the ruin, in the fragmented music,
in the weight of memory. The choir's purpose, feeding on guilt, on confession, remained unseen, patient, waiting. Harrow's hands shook. The wind shifted. The ruins seemed to lean inward. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls. He could almost see figures among the debris. Choir members, faces hollow, hands trembling, watching silently. And then a note, louder, clearer, a single tone splitting the night. A reminder that the cathedral's influence endured, that even in abandonment, even in decay, the echoes persisted. The historian rose slowly, each step careful, every sense alert. Music carried, dissonant and haunting, a thread that bound past and present. He walked through the nave, past fallen pews, over rubble, listening. The choir remained, not corporeal, not alive, but not gone, waiting for another witness, another listener, another confession to feed upon. Outside, the village was quiet. Abandoned buildings leaned into shadows. Fog clung to streets. The memory of the choir haunted every empty window, every shuttered door. Harrow paused at the steps. The ruins loomed behind him, silent and patient. The music drifted faintly, carried by the wind, fragments of a memory that refused to die. And that's when he realized